So let's take another round of questions, and then we'll have another round of responses, and then I think we'll need to close.
Hi, my name's Triad. I work at the Food Bank for New York City, and I'm going to, I guess, challenge the panel to answer Nick's question about food insecurity. I was hoping to hear that addressed by the panelists in the first round, so I'm renewing it for this round.
Hi, I'm a visitor from Australia, invited by Nick yesterday, so thanks a lot. It's been a tremendous morning. I just wanted to contribute from a position of ignorance about America to this issue of engagement with the food industry at a different level. And that's to say, what is the role, if any, of disinvestment? I mean, there's pressure these days to disinvestment in fossil fuel industries, and I wonder what the role in the food industry is, trying to persuade small and institutional investors to disinvest in unhealthy food producers. And in parallel with that, the issue of shareholder pressure to get people to producers, big corporations to change behavior, or get, in some cases, far more progressive, perhaps Nick, onto the board of Coca-Cola or something like that through voting. So it's just a question about a different approach to engaging and changing the industry.
I guess to maybe piggyback on your question, are there any new policy initiatives that are being placed in food banks or soup kitchens or senior citizen sites in terms of, the lower salt initiatives or anything like that?
It's absolutely clear that individuals who indicate that they're food insecure are at a high risk of obesity and a high risk for having poor diets. And so we have this weird paradox of people saying that they're food insecure and having high rates of obesity. I think what has always struck me about this work is simply that the food insecurity questions on these questionnaires that are put out are part of a panel of questions that also talk about insecurity around paying rent, insecurity around paying heat, insecurity around paying clothing, and it's just a marker of poverty. And I don't think there's anything special about the particular question from a battery of 10 questions that ask all these different ways in which you feel constrained in your life because of your economic position. I think that it's absolutely clear that people living in poverty, whether it's different dimensions of poverty, are at higher risk of obesity. And I think focusing on this paradoxical question of somebody saying yes on the food insecurity checkbox and having a high risk of obesity may be distracting us from this overall question of how is poverty in general related to constraints around diet that then bring us at risk for obesity. And so a lot of our work is not on this food insecurity specific question. A lot of our work is around this question on both individual poverty and neighborhood level poverty. And we see that individuals who are rich but live in poor neighborhoods have a different risk from obesity from people who are poor who live in poor neighborhoods. And so in New York City, we can try and understand sort of like the independent effects of your own personal income and the effects of the income of the people around you, because the income of the people around you in part determines whether a Whole Foods is going to open up or some other venue for food is going to open up. And so we're trying to think through both why does my income matter and the income of the people who live around me matter in sort of determining my choices. So I know my position on this is outside of the mainstream. So.
I was actually going to take a pretty similar position. I think I just didn't know it was outside the mainstream. I think that it completely is a question of poverty more generally, and I think that you can parse that lots of different ways. But I think that's the kind of huge underlying factor that we need to understand better. I mean, obesity is not completely a problem caused by poverty, but it's one that's hugely complicated by, and solutions are hugely complicated by it. And I think if we could obviously figure out a way to fix that, a lot of our obesity problems, not all of them, but many of them would go away. But I think we're not there yet. But I do kind of think of it in that larger frame than I do the particular food insecurity part. I think that it's been an unfortunate happenstance, particularly in New York City, that these communities have not been as parsimonious and harmonious as they probably could be. And I think we'll get to a place where they are, and I think that's maybe part of the growing pains of both of these fields. On the point on shareholder activism and getting Nick on the Coke board, I mean, I think that if anything, you've probably seen, at least in the States, movement in the other direction and pushback in the other direction. Pepsi was making some waves about doing some more healthful stuff, and you, if anything, you saw their shareholders say, you know, you're not increasing profits at the rate we think you are, and we think it's because of this. Whether it is or not, I don't think we know yet, but if anything, I think in the States we've seen movement in that direction, unfortunately.
So to go back to the question of food insecurity and some of the interventions we're putting in place that might be addressing both that as well as obesity, because those two circles, you know, I think are concentric and overlapping certainly. So two things. So one, obviously, the food standards that I mentioned earlier. The range of agencies affected by our food standards is very broad. And if you think about some of the populations impacted, it's populations in our homeless shelters, populations in jails, populations in schools, very broad reach, and reaches over 270 million people through 270 million meals served. And if you do a quick back of the envelope, that's enough meals for every single New Yorker 3 times a day for 10 days. So obviously it has pretty significant reach. So that's one of the ways. And the second is, you know, there is some work now that's going actually with Kim Kessler and the Office of the Food Policy Coordinator with City Hall and the Health Department, in talking to food banks and working on healthy guidelines for healthy donations. So working both with food companies that are donating foods, and then also with the food banks and food pantries and how they are packaging those goods into a basket and giving them to consumers coming in. So working on both of those aspects to really help increase the nutritional profile of things that are served.
And I wanted to close maybe by suggesting a new both policy direction and policy research direction that I think speaks to several of the issues we've been talking about lately: hunger, food insecurity, the role of corporations, and that's to examine more closely the development of a stronger public sector in the food market. And I think there are several bodies of experience worth exploring. New York City itself had a pretty robust public food market sector in the earlier part of the last century that still exists. La Marqueta is part of it, some of the lower Manhattan food markets, but we've not used them as a way of making fresh, healthy local food more available to a large extent, nor of providing subsidized food to low-income people, which were at least part of the original intent. I think we need to look back at that. And there's also experience in many other countries. Brazil is a country worth looking at, where they use food policy both to support local agriculture by insisting that 30% of the food served in schools comes from small farmers, locally grown, and also having public restaurants that provide subsidized healthy food that is really a mainstay for many low-income urban Brazilian families. And for those who the public sector involvement is maybe too controversial, there are also things going on in Toronto, for example, where it's non-governmental organizations that have created a sort of NGO sector of food and deliver food to food insecure families and make food available in a variety of neighborhoods. And I think that is a way of competing with the industrial processed food sector. It will take a long time for it to be a realistic source of food for a significant portion of the population, but if we don't start now, we'll not be getting there. And I encourage people to look at Mark Bittman's column in the editorial column recently, which I think talked about the value of a small food producer sector there, both from an environmental and a nutritional and a cost point of view. And I think New York City could really become a leader in the nation in the next few years in developing a public sector in food. I want to thank our panelists. You were terrific. I think so much accomplished, so much still to be done. And I want to thank you all for your great questions. We hope to keep this discussion going.